What would you do if in a single night, your life turned completely upside down? Grace Carter was just an ordinary girl from Brooklyn who accompanied her friend to a charity event. But when she was pushed onto the stage at a romantic dinner auction, something extraordinary happened. The powerful Sebastian Montgomery, known for his coldness, shocked everyone by making a bid no one expected. But did he know what he was buying? Because what came next changed everything. If this story has already sparked your curiosity, please leave your like to motivate me to continue. Subscribe to the channel to follow every chapter, and tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Your presence here makes all the difference. The Lexington Grand Hotel had always been a symbol of power in Manhattan. Its glass towers reflected the city lights like diamonds against the night sky, and on the 42nd floor, New York's most exclusive rooftop welcomed only those whose names graced the financial pages of newspapers. It was there that Grace Carter found herself that October Friday, feeling like an intruder in her own borrowed dress. "You look beautiful, Grace. Stop worrying," whispered Maya, her best friend since college, lovingly adjusting Grace's blonde hair. "That black dress is perfect on you." Grace took a deep breath, trying to ignore the knot in her stomach. The fabric of the dress was finer and more elegant than anything she had ever touched. Around them, women glided through the ballroom like swans, their jewelry catching the light from crystal chandeliers, while men in tuxedos exchanged handshakes worth millions. "Maya, I shouldn't be here," Grace murmured, watching the other women. "Look at them. Look at me. I work answering phones in an office in Brooklyn." "So what?" Maya smiled, taking 2 champagne flutes from a passing tray. "You have as much right to be here as any of them. Besides, this is a charity event. The money goes to underprivileged children. You're part of this cause." Grace accepted the flute, but her hands trembled slightly. The champagne tasted different from anything she had ever tried, smoother, more refined. Even the drinks here seemed to belong to a world different from hers. Across the ballroom, Sebastian Montgomery observed the crowd with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating investments. At 32, he had built an energy empire that rivaled the country's largest corporations. His Armani tuxedo fell perfectly over his broad shoulders, and his dark eyes held the coldness of someone who had learned too early that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Sebastian, you need to participate in the auction," said Victoria Ashworth, a socialite whose parents had founded half of Wall Street's banks. She approached him with the predatory grace of someone who knew exactly what she wanted. "It would be a demonstration of support for the cause." "I've already made my donation, Victoria," Sebastian replied, taking a sip of his Scotch whiskey. "I don't need to buy dinners to show generosity." Victoria laughed, a crystalline and calculated sound. "But imagine what the papers would say. New York's most coveted bachelor finally finds someone interesting. It would be perfect for your image." Sebastian was about to respond when the presenter took the microphone on the small stage set up at the center of the ballroom. The lights dimmed slightly, directing all attention to the gray-haired man who smiled at the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, the most anticipated moment of the evening has arrived, our traditional romantic dinner auction to benefit the Hope Foundation." Grace felt her blood freeze. "Maya, what is this?" "Oh, it's fun. Some women volunteer to auction dinners with themselves. All the money goes to charity," Maya explained casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "And you didn't think to warn me?" Grace grabbed her friend's arm, her eyes widening in panic. "Because you're not participating, relax. Only women who signed up beforehand. Maya Richardson," the presenter's voice cut through the air, "our next volunteer." Grace watched the blood drain from her friend's face. Maya had signed up, and now she was being called to the stage, leaving Grace completely alone among that crowd of strangers. "I'll be right back," Maya whispered, handing her purse to Grace before walking toward the stage with a forced smile. Grace stood there, holding 2 purses and 2 champagne flutes, feeling more out of place than ever. She watched Maya climb onto the stage, where the presenter began describing her package, a dinner at the city's most exclusive French restaurant. "Let's start with $1,000, the presenter announced. Grace almost choked on her champagne. $1,000 for dinner. The bids rose quickly. 2,000, 3,000, 5,000. Grace watched, mesmerized by the ease with which these people threw money around as if it were loose change. Then the unthinkable happened. "Grace Carter!" the presenter suddenly shouted. Grace's world stopped. Every head turned in her direction. The flute slipped from her hands, shattering on the marble floor with a sound that echoed through the silent ballroom. "It seems we have a surprise volunteer," the presenter continued, smiling. "Our Maya's friend has just volunteered herself." "No, I didn't," Grace began to protest, but her voice came out as a whisper, muffled by the crowd's murmur. Two women from the organization appeared at her side like magic, guiding her gently but firmly toward the stage. Grace looked desperately at Maya, who seemed as shocked as she was. "I can't," Grace whispered to one of the organizers. "There's been a mistake." "Dear, don't worry. It's for a good cause," the woman replied with a maternal smile that brooked no objections. And then Grace found herself on stage, under the blinding lights, with hundreds of eyes fixed on her. Her heart was beating so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Her hands were sweating and she discreetly wiped them on her borrowed dress. "Here we have the charming Grace Carter," the presenter announced. "And how about we start with $500,000? The voice cut through the air like a blade. Deep, controlled, unwavering. The silence that followed was deafening. Grace felt her weak knees threaten to give way. Every eye turned to Sebastian Montgomery, who had stepped forward, his erect and confident posture contrasting dramatically with the visible shock on every face around him. $500,000, he repeated calmly, his dark eyes fixed on Grace, "and close the auction." The presenter stammered, clearly unsure how to proceed. $500,000 was more than the entire event had raised in the last 3 years combined. Grace looked at Sebastian through the stage lights, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. There was something in his eyes she couldn't decipher. Curiosity, challenge, or perhaps something deeper. "Sold," the presenter finally shouted, and the ballroom exploded in applause and murmurs of disbelief. Grace descended from the stage on trembling legs, and Sebastian approached her with measured steps. When he stopped before her, Grace realized how tall he was. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Sebastian Montgomery," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "Grace Carter," she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. "And you just spent $500,000 on dinner with a complete stranger." An almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of Sebastian's mouth. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I just made the best investment of my life." Grace felt a shiver run down her spine. She didn't know if it was fear or anticipation, but one thing was certain: her simple, predictable life had just taken a completely unexpected turn. And as Sebastian walked away, promising to contact her to arrange the dinner, Grace wondered if she would ever feel ready to discover what really lay behind those dark eyes and that impossible offer. The Skyview restaurant occupied the 50th floor of a midtown skyscraper, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Manhattan that made the city look like an ocean of golden lights. Grace had spent the entire week trying to prepare for this moment, but now, seated at the reserved table overlooking Central Park, she felt more nervous than ever. Sebastian arrived punctually at 8, impeccable in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Grace's annual salary. He moved through the restaurant with the naturalness of someone who had frequented such places since childhood, discreetly greeting the maitre d' like an old acquaintance. "You came," he said, pulling out his chair to sit. It wasn't a question, but Grace detected slight relief in his voice. "Did you really think I wouldn't?" Grace asked, trying to keep her voice steady while watching Sebastian settle in. "After you spent $500,000? Honestly?" Sebastian picked up the wine list, his long fingers leafing through the pages as if they were pages of a financial report. "I wasn't sure. Most people in my social circle would have cancelled to create more anticipation, or shown up 40 minutes late to prove they have a more important life." Grace blinked, surprised by his frankness. "Well, I'm not most people in your social circle." "No, you definitely aren't." Sebastian looked up from the menu and studied her with genuine curiosity. "And that's exactly why I'm here." The sommelier approached, and Sebastian ordered a bottle of Bordeaux that Grace was certain cost more than her rent. When they were alone again, silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but charged with unspoken questions. "Can I ask you something?" Grace finally broke the silence, nervously playing with the edge of her napkin. Why? Why did you make that offer? Sebastian tilted his head slightly, as if evaluating how much to reveal. Do you really want to know? I wouldn't have asked if I didn't. A genuine smile, the first Grace had seen from him, appeared on his face. Most of the women in that ballroom would have walked onto that stage like it was a runway, smiling for the cameras and flirting with the bidders. You looked terrified. I was terrified, Grace admitted with a nervous laugh. And even so, when you came down from the stage, you didn't thank me effusively or pretend to be impressed. You questioned me, called me a stranger, actually. Technically, I said you had spent $500,000 on dinner with a stranger. I didn't call you strange. Grace felt her cheeks flush slightly. Important distinction, Sebastian agreed, and Grace realized he was genuinely enjoying himself. But you understand my point. Authenticity is a rare commodity in my world. The sommelier returned with the wine, performing the entire ritual of opening and tasting. Grace watched Sebastian approve the wine with a subtle nod, a gesture so natural she realized how truly this was his world. And you? Sebastian asked after their glasses were served. How did you describe yourself, a girl who works answering phones in Brooklyn? What makes her accept dinner with a stranger who spends money irresponsibly? Grace took a sip of the wine, trying to buy time. It was extraordinary, smooth and complex in a way she hadn't known wine could be. Curiosity, I guess, and maybe a bit of disbelief. I mean, who does that? Who offers $500,000 for dinner? Someone who can afford it, Sebastian replied simply. That's not a real answer, isn't it? No. Many people can afford many things. That doesn't mean they do them. Grace leaned slightly forward, her green eyes meeting his. You were making a point, showing power. Or maybe, she paused, studying his expression, maybe you were bored, and I was just an interesting novelty. Sebastian remained silent for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more serious. You want to know the truth? I don't know why I did that. He looked up at her. I was on autopilot, like always. Another charity night, another social obligation. And then you were pushed onto that stage, clearly terrified, and something in me reacted. Reacted how? As if I wanted to protect you. Or maybe protect myself from the futility of it all. I'm not sure. Grace felt something stir in her chest, a mixture of surprise and something she wasn't ready to name. Do you make a habit of being so honest with strangers? I make a habit of not being honest with anyone, Sebastian admitted. It's safer that way. The waiter approached to take their orders. Grace chose the grilled salmon, while Sebastian ordered the filet mignon. When they were alone again, Grace decided to risk a more direct question. Sebastian, where do you work? I mean, I know you have money, obviously, but Montgomery Renewables, Inc., he replied. It's a renewable energy company. I'm the CEO. Grace almost choked on her wine. Montgomery Renewables? You own Montgomery Renewables? Sebastian frowned. You know the company. I work there. Grace felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. I mean, I work for Greenfield Administrative Services. We're an outsourced company that provides administrative services to various corporations, including Montgomery Renewables, Sebastian finished, his eyes widening slightly. You work for me, indirectly, but, oh my God, Grace put her hand to her forehead. You're my boss, technically, remotely, but still. What department? Customer service. I handle complaints, account questions, that sort of thing. Grace felt her cheeks burning. You probably don't even know my department exists. Actually, I do. You're efficient. We receive monthly reports on customer satisfaction. Sebastian leaned forward, an intrigued expression taking over his face. How long have you worked there? 2 years. And in all those 2 years, you've been an almost mythological figure. Mr. Montgomery wants this, Mr. Montgomery approved that. I never imagined that I was a real person. That you were... Grace gestured vaguely in his direction. This, young, approachable, capable of talking like a normal human being. Sebastian laughed, a genuine laugh, low and rich. Approachable? Grace, I just spent $500,000 to have a conversation with you. I'm not exactly what you'd call approachable. Maybe not financially, Grace conceded, but you're here, talking to me, being honest. That's more emotional accessibility than I expected from someone who... From someone like me what? Grace hesitated, then decided to be equally honest. From someone who has the power to change people's lives with a nod of his head. Someone who lives in a world where $500,000 is an amount you can spend impulsively on dinner. And that bothers you? It fascinates me, Grace admitted, and scares me a little too. The plates arrived, and they ate in a more comfortable silence, each processing the night's revelations. Grace noticed that Sebastian ate methodically, almost as if it were a task that needed to be completed. There was no pleasure there, just efficiency. "Do you enjoy what you do?" Grace asked suddenly. "What?" "Working, running a company, all this life." She gestured toward the spectacular view of the city. Sebastian stopped eating, considering the question. "It's what I know how to do. It's what I've always done." "That's not a real answer," Grace echoed the words he had used before. Sebastian smiled again, and Grace realized how completely it transformed his face. "Do you make a habit of using my own words against me?" "When necessary." "The truth is," Sebastian paused as if revealing a secret, "I don't remember the last time I asked myself if I enjoy what I do. It's just who I am." "And who are you when you're not being the CEO of Montgomery Renewables?" Sebastian looked at her for a long moment, something vulnerable flickering in his eyes before disappearing. "Honestly, I don't know if there's a me separate from that." Grace felt her heart tighten. There was something deeply lonely in that admission, something that made her want to reach out and touch his hand on the table. Instead, she held her wine glass firmly. "That's sad," she said softly. "It's practical." "No, Sebastian, it's sad." The rest of dinner passed in lighter conversation, but Grace couldn't forget that moment of raw honesty. When they finished dessert, a tiramisu that was probably better than anything Grace had tasted in her life, Sebastian asked for the check. "Thank you," Grace said as they prepared to leave. "For dinner, for the conversation, for spending $500,000 on you? For seeing me," she said simply. Sebastian stopped mid-motion of putting away his wallet, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, Grace saw beyond the mask of the successful executive, beyond the calculated confidence. She saw a man who had forgotten how to connect with another human being. And she realized he had seen something in her too, something she didn't even know existed. "Grace," Sebastian said, as they stepped out of the restaurant into the cool October night. "May I see you again?" The question was simple, but Grace could feel the weight behind it. It wasn't just about another dinner or another date. It was about two people from completely different worlds, wondering if they could build a bridge between them. "I'd like that," she replied, and saw something light up in his dark eyes. But as Sebastian called his driver and Grace waited for her Uber, she wondered if she really knew what she was getting into. The days following dinner at Skyview passed like a blur for Grace. She found herself staring out the window of her small Brooklyn apartment, reliving every word, every glance, every moment of charged silence she had shared with Sebastian. Working became a surreal experience. Every report she processed, every call she answered, now carried the weight of knowing that her decisions, somehow, reached him. "You're acting strange," commented Jessica, her cubicle neighbor, on Thursday afternoon. "More distracted than usual, and you've been smiling at your computer." "I'm not smiling at my computer," Grace protested, but realized she actually was. "Right, and I'm the Queen of England." Jessica leaned over the partitions separating their workstations. "Spill it, who is he?" Grace was about to deny everything when her phone rang. The number on the screen made her choke. "Grace Carter speaking," she answered, trying to keep her voice professional. "Hello, Grace." Sebastian's deep voice through the phone made her stomach flip. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work." Grace looked around the office, suddenly paranoid that someone might overhear. "No, everything's fine. How can I help you, Mr. Montgomery?" There was a pause, and Grace imagined he had caught her deliberate formality. "Actually, I was calling to invite you to lunch, today, if you can get away from the office for a few hours." Grace's heart raced. I only have an hour for lunch." 2 hours, then. I'll call your supervisor." "Sebastian, you can't just—" "I can, actually, and I'm doing it." There was an amused note in his voice. "I'll pick you up in an hour." The call ended before Grace could protest. She stared at the phone, torn between shock and disbelief. Who was that? Jessica practically leaped over the partition. My boss," Grace murmured, technically not lying. "Your boss invites you to lunch. Grace, you need to tell me what's going on." But Grace was already getting up, grabbing her purse with trembling hands. 15 minutes later, her supervisor approached with a confused expression. "Grace, I just got a call from corporate. Apparently, you've been requested for a special meeting this afternoon. Something about direct customer feedback." Grace just nodded, not trusting her voice. Sebastian had actually called, and he had invented an excuse that technically wasn't a lie. She was, in a sense, a client of the company's own services. An hour later, Grace stood in front of the office building, trying not to look as nervous as she felt. Sebastian's black Mercedes stopped at the curb exactly on time. "Get in," he said, rolling down the passenger window. Grace hesitated for a moment. Crossing that line, getting into his car, accepting being seen with him in public, seemed like a significant step she wasn't sure she was ready to take. "Grace," Sebastian's voice was softer now, almost gentle. "If you don't want to." She opened the door and got into the car before she could change her mind. "Hi," she said, suddenly shy. "Hi." Sebastian smiled, and Grace noticed how different he seemed away from the formal restaurant atmosphere. Younger, somehow. "Thank you for accepting the last-minute invitation. As if I had a choice, you called my supervisor. Technically, my assistant called, but yes, I could have been more subtle." Sebastian began driving, navigating Manhattan traffic with ease. "Where would you like to go?" Grace looked at him, surprised. "You didn't choose the place." "I thought you might want to choose, since on our first outing, I chose everything." "First outing?" Grace couldn't help but smile. "Is that what you're calling that $500,000 dinner?" "What would you call it?" Grace considered the question. "Honestly, I don't know. I don't have a frame of reference for it." Sebastian laughed. That genuine laugh Grace was beginning to love hearing. "Fair enough, so where to?" Grace looked out the window, watching Manhattan's glass and steel towers pass by them. An idea formed in her mind, perhaps reckless, but tempting. "Would you trust me to choose?" "Completely." The immediate response surprised her. "Even not knowing where I'm taking you?" "Especially not knowing." Sebastian glanced at her quickly before returning his eyes to traffic. "You surprised me once. I'm curious to see if you can do it again." Grace gave directions, guiding him through Manhattan until they reached a small park near the East River. It wasn't glamorous, just a few benches, some trees, and a modest view of the bridge. "A park?" Sebastian asked as he parked. "A park," Grace confirmed, "with food trucks, and real people eating real food that doesn't cost someone's monthly salary." Sebastian turned off the engine and turned to look at her. "You're testing me." "Maybe." Grace opened the car door. "The question is, will you pass?" They walked to the food trucks, Grace discreetly watching Sebastian. He seemed displaced, not uncomfortable exactly, but like someone consciously navigating unfamiliar territory. "What do you recommend?" he asked, looking at the food truck menus. "Depends. Are you adventurous?" "In business, absolutely. In food..." Sebastian paused. "Honestly, I've eaten the same thing for lunch for probably 3 years. My assistant always orders the same sandwich from the same place." Grace felt a pang of sadness for him. "Sebastian, when was the last time you did something spontaneous? Something just because you wanted to?" The question caught him off guard. He remained silent for a long moment, watching the people around them. Executives on lunch break, students, tourists, families. "Inviting you to lunch today," he said finally. "And before that?" Another long silence. "I don't remember." Grace felt her heart tighten again. She guided him to her favorite food truck, a small trailer selling authentic tacos, and ordered for both of them. "You didn't even ask what I wanted," Sebastian observed, but there was amusement in his voice. "Do you trust me?" "Apparently, yes." They found an empty bench overlooking the river. Grace watched Sebastian take his first bite of the taco, seeing his expression change from caution to genuine surprise. "This is," he began, "better than the sandwich your assistant always orders?" Infinitely better. Sebastian took another bite, this time with more enthusiasm. How did you find this place? I work nearby. I've been here for 2 years. I come here when I need to think, or when I can't stand eating ham sandwiches in the break room anymore. 2 years, Sebastian repeated, as if processing something. And all this time I've been less than 10 blocks away, eating the same boring sandwich in my glass office. It's a different perspective, isn't it? Sebastian looked around, really looked as if seeing the park, the people, life happening around him for the first time. Grace, can I ask you something? Of course. What do you think of me? Honestly. The question caught her off guard. Grace studied his face, trying to find the right words. Honestly, I think you're a man who forgot how to live. You exist, function, succeed, but you don't really live. She paused, seeing if she had gone too far. And I think you know it. Sebastian remained quiet for a long time, watching the river waters. That's a harsh assessment, he said finally. You asked for honesty. I did. Sebastian turned to look at her. And you? What should I think about Grace Carter? That I'm an ordinary person who somehow found herself in the middle of an extraordinary situation and is trying to figure out how to navigate it without losing herself. You're not ordinary, Grace. Of course I am. No. Sebastian leaned slightly toward her. Ordinary people don't question CEOs about their life choices. Ordinary people don't bring men like me to food trucks and make them realize they don't know how to live. Grace felt her cheeks flush. Ordinary people do that all the time. You just don't usually pay attention to them. Touché. Sebastian finished his taco and leaned back on the bench. Can I tell you something I've never told anyone? His tone had changed. Lower, more intimate. Grace nodded. Sometimes, when I'm in endless meetings or social events, where everyone says exactly what they're expected to say, I wonder if this is it. If this is life. And then I remember I have responsibilities, employees, expectations. He paused. But today, sitting here, eating a $2 taco with a woman who works for me without knowing she knows me, I feel more alive than I have in years. Grace felt something stir in her chest, something dangerous and exciting at the same time. Sebastian, I know. He turned to look at her directly. I know this is complicated. I know we're from different worlds. I know there are ethical, hierarchical, practical issues. He paused. But I also know I don't want this to end here. Grace looked at him, really looked. She saw beyond the expensive suit, beyond the corporate confidence, beyond the power and money. She saw a man allowing himself to be vulnerable for the first time in a long time. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to know you, Grace Carter. Not the employee, not the woman in the borrowed dress at the auction. You. The woman who brought me here, who made me laugh, who made me question things I've accepted as truth for years. Grace's heart was beating too fast. What if you don't like what you discover? What if I like it more than I should? The question hung between them, charged with possibilities and dangers. Grace knew she should be sensible, should remember the differences between them, should protect her heart. Instead, she heard herself saying, "Then I guess we'll have to find out, won't we?" Sebastian smiled, not the controlled smile he used in business situations, but something genuine and hopeful. "Yes," he said. "I think we will." But as they drove back to the office, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she had just embarked on something that could change her life forever, in ways she might not be prepared to face. The following 2 weeks brought a delicate and dangerous dance to Grace's life. Sebastian began appearing in places he had never been before, on the ground floor of the administrative building, supposedly checking operations, in the cafeteria, claiming he wanted to better understand the work environment. Even in her department, disguising his visits as routine inspections that were definitely not routine. "Mr. Montgomery is here again," Jessica whispered on Friday morning, spying over the cubicle. "Third time this week. Do you think they're going to fire someone?" Grace kept her eyes fixed on her computer screen, pretending not to feel the familiar knot in her stomach that always came when she knew Sebastian was nearby. "I don't know," she murmured. "Maybe it's just a new management policy." "Management?" Jessica lowered her voice even more. "Grace, he's looking over here, directly at your cubicle." Grace forced herself not to turn around. She could feel the weight of Sebastian's gaze, that intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in the world. It was disturbing and thrilling at the same time. "Miss Carter," the deep voice cut through the office murmur. Grace briefly closed her eyes before turning around. Sebastian stood a few meters from her station, impeccable in a navy suit, but there was something in his eyes that only she could recognize. An amused, almost mischievous gleam. "Yes, Mr. Montgomery. I need to discuss some customer satisfaction issues. Could you come to my office in 15 minutes? The entire office stopped. Grace could feel every eye on her, could hear her colleagues' thoughts. Why Grace Carter, of all people, was being summoned by the CEO. "Of course, sir," she replied, keeping her voice steady. Sebastian nodded formally and walked away, but not before Grace caught the slightest smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "My God," Jessica whispered when Sebastian left the floor. "What did you do?" "Nothing," Grace replied, but her voice sounded less convincing than intended. 15 minutes later, Grace stood before Sebastian's office door on the 40th floor of Montgomery Renewable's main building. She had been there only once before during her initial interview 2 years ago, and even then it had been with the HR supervisor. Now about to enter Sebastian's domain alone, she felt like she was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. "Come in," came his voice when she knocked. The office was exactly as Grace had imagined, all glass and steel, with a spectacular view of Manhattan and furniture that looked like it came from an architecture magazine. Sebastian was standing behind his desk, but when she entered, he approached, closing the door behind her. "Customer satisfaction?" Grace asked, raising an eyebrow. "Technically, I really do need to discuss this with you," Sebastian said, but his eyes were dancing. "You are a client of our services, considering your company provides services to us." "How convenient." "I thought so." Sebastian gestured toward the chairs in front of his desk. "Sit, please." Grace sat, trying not to be impressed by the luxury surrounding her. "Sebastian, you can't keep doing this." "Doing what?" "Showing up at my work. Making up excuses to see me. People are starting to notice." Sebastian sat in the chair next to her, instead of behind his desk. "And that bothers you?" "It worries me," Grace corrected. "I need this job, and if someone finds out whatever we're doing, it could compromise my position." "No one will find out." "How can you be sure?" Sebastian was quiet for a moment, and Grace realized he really hadn't considered the implications for her. In his world, he was probably used to doing what he wanted without worrying about consequences for people in more vulnerable positions. "You're right," he said finally. "I didn't think about how this could affect you." "You don't think about many things from other people's perspectives, do you?" Grace asked, but without malice. "It's the privilege of always being the one who makes decisions, never the one who suffers them." Sebastian studied her for a long moment. "You have a very direct way of putting me in my place. Someone needs to do it. And you appointed yourself to the position." Grace smiled despite the tension. "Apparently." "Grace," Sebastian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I don't want you to lose your job. I don't want any of this to hurt you, but I also don't want to stop seeing you. So what do you suggest? That we be more discreet, that we meet outside the work environment?" He paused. "That perhaps we keep this between us for now." Something in his tone made Grace stiffen. "Keep it between us like a secret. Just until we figure out what this is, what we're doing." "And what do you think we're doing, Sebastian?" The question caught him off guard. He leaned back in his chair, running his hand through his hair, a gesture Grace was learning he made when he was uncomfortable. "I don't know," he admitted. "I know I like being with you. I know you make me feel different, more like myself than I've felt in years. But our worlds are very different, Grace. My life is complicated." Grace felt a pang of irritation. "My life isn't." "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Grace stood up, beginning to pace around the room. "That your billionaire CEO life is more complicated than my working woman life who can barely pay rent? That your problems are more important than mine? Grace. Or maybe you mean it's easy for me because I have nothing to lose, because people like me are disposable." "Stop." Sebastian also stood up, his voice firmer. You know that's not what I think, do I? Grace turned to face him. Sebastian, in 2 weeks, you've taken me to 2 places. An expensive restaurant where no one I know could see me, and a park where no one you know would go. You show up at my work disguising our meetings as business. You want to keep me a secret. Exactly what should I think? The accusation hung in the air between them. Sebastian remained silent for a long time, and Grace could see the conflict in his eyes. You're right, he said finally, his voice low. I'm being a coward. Not a coward. Grace softened slightly. Cautious. I understand caution. But Sebastian, if you're ashamed to be with me, or if I'm just an interesting novelty you want to explore in secret, you're not a novelty. Sebastian took a step toward her. And I'm definitely not ashamed of you. Then what are you afraid of? The question hit him like a punch. Grace could see it in his eyes, the way they widened slightly, as if she had touched something he wasn't ready to examine. I'm afraid, he said slowly, that when people from my world meet you, they'll try to find ways to diminish you. And I'm afraid I'm not strong enough to protect you from that. The raw honesty in his voice disarmed her. Grace felt her anger dissipating, replaced by something more complex. Sebastian, I don't need you to protect me. I need you to be honest with me about what you want. I want you, he said without hesitation. I want to know you better, spend time with you, discover where this can lead us. Publicly? Sebastian hesitated, and in that hesitation, Grace had her answer. I understand, she said, grabbing her purse. Grace, wait. No, it's okay. I understand. Grace headed for the door. You want to have me, but on your terms, in secret, like something you can control and hide when convenient. That's not... Grace stopped with her hand on the doorknob and turned to look at him. Sebastian, I grew up being invisible, being the girl people don't notice, who doesn't matter. I thought with you it was different. It is different. Not if you want me hidden. Grace opened the door. When you figure out if you can claim me publicly, call me. Until then, I think it's better we keep things strictly professional. Grace, but she had already left, leaving Sebastian alone in his glass office, looking through the open door at the empty hallway. Later that afternoon, as Grace rode home on the crowded subway, she wondered if she had been too harsh with him. Part of her understood Sebastian's position, the social pressure, the expectations, the difference between their worlds. But a bigger part of her, the part that had been ignored and belittled too many times in life, refused to accept being hidden, even if it was by the man she was beginning to love. And as the train crossed Brooklyn, Grace made a decision. She wouldn't be anyone's secret, not even Sebastian Montgomery's. Not this time. 2 weeks passed in tense silence. Grace threw herself into work with an almost fierce determination, processing reports and answering calls as if each task were a critical mission. Her colleagues noticed the change. She was more focused, more serious, less inclined to the casual conversations that used to break the monotony of the workday. Sebastian, for his part, had stopped appearing on her floor. Grace caught herself looking toward the elevators every time she heard the familiar sound of doors opening, hating herself for this involuntary reaction, hating herself even more for the pang of disappointment she felt each day that passed without seeing him. It was Jessica who finally broke the silence on a rainy Thursday in November. "All right, enough," she said, dropping a cup of coffee on Grace's desk. "You're going to tell me what's going on, or I'll have to figure it out myself." "I don't know what you're talking about," Grace murmured, keeping her eyes on the screen. "Grace Carter, you're acting like someone who got their heart broken. And considering the last time you were like this was after that idiot Marcus broke up with you via email, I'm worried." Grace finally looked up. Jessica was standing beside her cubicle with her arms crossed and an expression that wouldn't accept evasions. "It's nothing like that," Grace said, but her voice sounded unconvincing even to herself. "It is, and it has to do with those strange meetings you had with the CEO, doesn't it?" Grace's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "Please, Grace. You think nobody noticed? Sebastian Montgomery doesn't come down here to discuss customer satisfaction with administrative-level employees. And after those meetings, you got all weird and distant. Jessica leaned closer, lowering her voice. What really happened? Grace looked around the office, making sure no one else was listening. Then, to her own surprise, she felt her eyes fill with tears. Jess, I made a huge mistake. Tell me. And Grace told her. Not everything, but enough. The auction, the dinners, the unexpected connection, the conflict about keeping everything secret. Jessica listened in silence, her eyes widening progressively. My God, Jessica sighed when Grace finished. You're in love with Sebastian Montgomery. I'm not in love, Grace protested weakly. Right. And I'm Madonna. Jessica sat on the edge of Grace's desk. The question is, what are you going to do now? Nothing. There's nothing to do. He made it clear where I fit in his life. Did he really, or is he just scared? Grace looked at her friend with an expression of someone who didn't want to hope. What's the difference? The difference is that fear can be overcome. Shame. Well, shame is a more serious problem. Before Grace could respond, her phone rang. It was a number she recognized immediately, even after 2 weeks without contact. Answer it, Jessica whispered. Grace Carter, she said, keeping her voice professional. Grace. Sebastian's voice sounded lower than normal, almost hesitant. I need to talk to you. If it's about work, I can transfer you to... It's not about work. Please, just meet me tonight. Grace closed her eyes, fighting the urge to say yes immediately. Sebastian, please, he repeated, and there was something in his voice she had never heard before. Vulnerability, almost pleading. Where? You choose. Anywhere. Grace looked at Jessica, who was gesturing frantically for her to accept. The pier at Brooklyn Bridge Park, 8 o'clock, Grace said finally. I'll be there. The call ended, and Grace stared at the phone. Pier? Jessica asked. Interesting choice. It's public, but not a place where anyone from his world would go, Grace explained. In other words, you're still testing whether he's willing to leave his comfort zone for you. Grace didn't respond, but Jessica was right. She was testing. And part of her hoped he would fail, because it would be easier to forget Sebastian Montgomery if she could keep thinking of him as just another rich, selfish man. At 8 o'clock, Grace stood on the pier, watching Manhattan's lights reflect on the dark waters of the East River. The cold November wind cut through her coat, but she barely felt it. She was too nervous, too busy wondering if Sebastian would show up, and if he did, what he would say. Grace. She turned and saw him walking toward her. He wasn't wearing a suit, the first time she had seen him like this. Dark jeans, grey sweater, hair slightly mussed by the wind. He looked normal, almost vulnerable. You came, she said. Did you doubt I would? A little. Sebastian stopped a few meters from her, as if unsure how close he could get. Grace, about our last conversation. Sebastian, no. Grace raised her hand. Before you say anything, I need you to understand something. I don't want to be anyone's secret. I don't want to be someone you hide when it's convenient. I know. Do you? Because the last time we talked, you made it very clear you weren't ready to claim me publicly. Sebastian ran his hand through his hair, that familiar gesture indicating discomfort. You were right. I was being a coward. And now? Now? Sebastian took a step toward her. Now I've spent 2 miserable weeks wondering why the hell I let you walk out of my office. Grace felt something stir in her chest, but forced herself to keep her guard up. That doesn't answer my question. Grace, do you want the truth? The complete truth? She nodded. Sebastian looked at the water for a moment before continuing. My entire life has been built around control. I control my company, I control my image, I control my emotions, I control who I associate with, and then you show up and mess all of that up. Sorry? No. Sebastian shook his head quickly. Don't apologize, it's the best thing that's ever happened to me, but it's also the most terrifying. Grace could hear the sincerity in his voice, but she needed to hear more. Why terrifying? Because for the first time in my life, I care more about what someone thinks than what's strategically smart. Because when you walked out of my office that day, I felt like something essential had been ripped away from me. Sebastian moved closer, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light of the pier. And because I know that if I bring you into my world, people are going to try to hurt you. They'll say you're with me for the money, that you don't belong in our circle, that you're just a phase. And I'm afraid I won't be able to protect you from that. Sebastian, Grace said softly, I don't need you to protect me from people's opinions. I need you to be on my side when they express them. What if I can't? What if I fail? Then you fail. But at least you try. Grace took a step toward him. The question is, are you willing to try? Sebastian looked at her for a long moment, and Grace could see the battle happening in his eyes. The man who had been trained his whole life to make calculated and safe decisions, fighting against something that was anything but safe. There's a charity event next week, he said finally. A gala at the Metropolitan Museum. All of New York's elite will be there. Grace's heart raced. And I'd like you to go with me. Publicly. As my date. Grace felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Are you sure? I'm sure I want to be with you. I'm sure I'm tired of hiding something that makes me happy. Sebastian extended his hand toward her. I'm not sure how it's going to be, but I know I want to find out. Grace looked at his hand, then at his face. She could see the fear there, but also determination, and, more importantly, she could see something she was beginning to recognize as love. All right, she said, placing her hand in his. Let's find out together. Sebastian smiled, that genuine smile she loved, and pulled her closer. There's just one thing, Grace said, trying to keep her tone serious. I'm going to need a dress. Sebastian laughed, the tension of the past weeks finally dissipating. Grace Carter, I would buy you 1,000 dresses if it meant you'd be by my side. One should do, she said, smiling. But Sebastian. Yes? If you change your mind, if you decide it's too risky or too complicated, tell me before the event. Don't let me find out in the middle of the night, surrounded by people from your world. Sebastian let go of her hand, only to place both hands on Grace's face, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. Grace Carter, I may be many things, controlling, cautious, sometimes an idiot, but I'm not a coward, not when it comes to you. And then he kissed her, there on the pier with Manhattan's lights reflecting in the water around them, sealing a promise they both hoped he could keep. But as they walked back from the bridge, Grace couldn't help but hear a small voice in her head, asking if Sebastian really understood what it meant to be with her publicly, and if he would be strong enough to face the consequences when they came. Saturday morning arrived with a typical November gray sky and a phone call that would change everything. Grace was having coffee in her small kitchen when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was familiar, but heavy with concern. Gracie, it's Mom. Hi, Mom. Everything okay? Grace immediately detected the tension in her mother's voice. Well, your father is in the hospital. Grace's heart stopped. What? What happened? Nothing serious, honey, nothing serious. Just some routine tests that got a bit complicated. The doctor wants to keep him under observation for a few days. Her mother's voice was trying to sound reassuring, but Grace knew her mother well enough to hear the fear behind the words. I'm coming up right now. No, Gracie, you don't need to. Mom, I'm coming, end of discussion. Grace hung up and immediately began throwing clothes into a suitcase. Her parents lived in a small town in upstate New York, about 3 hours away. It was a place she visited religiously every 2 months, but which seemed to belong to a completely different universe from her current life in Manhattan. She was almost ready to leave when her phone rang again. Sebastian. Grace, about our plans for today. Sebastian, I need to cancel. My father is in the hospital and I need to go see him. Is everything all right? Is it serious? I don't know. My mother says no, but... Grace felt her voice falter slightly. Where is he? Grace gave him the name of the hospital, a small institution in Millbrook that Sebastian had probably never heard of. I'll come with you, Sebastian said immediately. Sebastian, you don't need to... Grace, you're worried and upset. You shouldn't drive 3 hours alone in that state. I don't have a car. I was going to take the bus. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Bus. Grace, let me take you. Sebastian, you don't understand. It's not like going to Skyview or the pier. It's my family, my real life. It's a small hospital in a small town where everyone knows everyone and where you grew up, where your roots are. Sebastian's voice was surprisingly gentle. Grace, if you want me in your life, if we're really going to try to make this work, then I need to know all the parts of who you are, not just the Manhattan version. Grace closed her eyes, feeling the weight of truth in those words. All right. But Sebastian, my family isn't like the people you know. We don't have money, we don't have connections. My father works at a mechanic's shop and my mother is a retired elementary school teacher. Grace, Sebastian said gently, do you think I care about that? I think you may think you don't care until you really see it. Then let me see. An hour later, Sebastian arrived in a discreet SUV, not the Mercedes Grace expected, but something simpler, more appropriate for a trip to the country. He was dressed casually, jeans, sweater, a leather jacket that made him look younger and more approachable. Ready? He asked when Grace got into the car. No, she admitted, but let's go anyway. The trip began in silence, Grace lost in worries about her father, and Sebastian apparently focused on the road. As they left the city, the landscape gradually changed from skyscrapers and concrete to trees and scattered houses. Tell me about them, Sebastian said finally. Your parents. Grace smiled for the first time that day. My father, Robert, has worked at the same shop for 25 years. He can fix anything. Cars, appliances, broken toys. When I was little, I thought he had magical powers. And your mother, Helen. She taught third grade for 30 years before retiring. She still substitutes when they need her. Grace looked out the window. They met in high school. They dated for 6 years before getting married because they wanted to be sure they could support themselves. Sebastian absorbed this information in silence. Do you have siblings? No. They tried for years to have more children after me, but it didn't happen. So it's just me. The only daughter who left the small town to try her luck in the big city. And they supported your decision? Grace laughed, but there was a note of sadness in the sound. They were terrified. They didn't know anyone who had done something like that, but they supported me anyway, even while afraid. As they approached Millbrook, Grace felt the familiar mixture of love and claustrophobia that always came over her when returning home. The streets were exactly as she remembered. Small houses with well-tended gardens, a few local shops, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers were immediately noticed. The hospital was small and simple, nothing like Manhattan's sophisticated medical facilities. Grace saw Sebastian look around as they entered, but to his credit, his expression revealed nothing but respectful interest. Gracie? Her mother's voice echoed down the hallway before Grace even saw her. Helen Carter was 58 years old and looked exactly like Grace imagined she herself would look in 30 years. Brown hair beginning to gray, gentle green eyes, and a smile that could light up any room. She ran to hug Grace, and for a moment, Grace felt like she was 12 again. How is he? Grace asked when they separated. Better. The doctor said it was just a scare. High blood pressure, stress. Nothing that can't be controlled with medication and some dietary changes. It was only then that Helen noticed Sebastian standing discreetly a few steps behind. Oh, she said, her eyes widening slightly. Hello? Mom, this is Sebastian. Sebastian Montgomery. Grace felt her cheeks flush. Sebastian, this is my mother, Helen. Sebastian stepped forward with a genuine smile. Mrs. Carter, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm sorry about your husband. Helen shook his hand, studying his face with the sharp gaze of a retired teacher. Montgomery, that name sounds familiar. Grace and Sebastian exchanged a quick look. He's a friend of mine, Mom. Helen didn't seem completely convinced, but had the grace not to press. Well, come along. Your father is awake and wants to see you. The hospital room was small and simple, but impeccably clean. Robert Carter was sitting up in bed, looking a bit pale but smiling when he saw Grace enter. There's my little girl, he said, opening his arms. Grace leaned in to hug him, breathing in the familiar scent of car grease and soap she always associated with safety and home. How are you feeling? She asked. Like a fool for scaring your mother, Robert admitted. It's just high blood pressure, Gracie, nothing that can't be controlled. Dad, this is Sebastian, Grace said, stepping back so Sebastian could approach. Robert extended his hand. and Sebastian shook it firmly. Grace watched the interaction carefully, her father assessing Sebastian with the direct, honest gaze he used to evaluate customers and broken cars. "Sebastian, is it? And what do you do, Sebastian?" "I work in renewable energy, Mr. Carter." "Renewable energy?" Robert perked up slightly. "Solar? Wind?" "Both, mainly. And some emerging technologies." To Grace's surprise, they began talking about solar panels and wind turbines. Her father, despite working with cars, had always been fascinated by alternative energy, a passion Grace had forgotten until she saw the two men talking animatedly. "Robert, leave the boy alone," Helen finally intervened. "They drove 3 hours to get here." "Actually," Sebastian said, "it's fascinating to hear the perspective of someone who works with traditional mechanics on emerging technologies." Robert smiled broadly. "He's smart, this one, Gracie." After an hour at the hospital with Robert clearly recovering well, Helen insisted that Grace and Sebastian come home for dinner. The Carter house was exactly as Grace had left it, small but cozy, full of family photos and mementos of a life lived with love and simplicity. Grace watched Sebastian discreetly as he looked around, trying to see her home through his eyes. "It's not much," Helen apologized, clearly nervous about having a guest she suspected was important. "It's perfect," Sebastian said sincerely. "You can feel that it's a real home." During dinner, a simple roast Helen had hurriedly prepared, Grace watched Sebastian interact with her parents. He asked questions about the town, about their work, about what it was like raising Grace. He listened genuinely, laughed at her father's jokes, complimented her mother's cooking. But it was after dinner, when Sebastian insisted on helping with the dishes despite Helen's protests, that Grace noticed something shifting. "He's special, that friend of yours," Helen whispered to Grace, while Sebastian talked with Robert in the living room. "Mom, don't mom me in that tone." "I know that look, Gracie, and I saw how he looks at you." Grace blushed. "It's complicated. Love always is, dear." Later that evening, when they were preparing to return to New York, Robert pulled Sebastian aside. "Sebastian, can I have a word with you?" Grace watched the two men talk on the front lawn, unable to hear what they were saying. When they returned, both seemed to have reached some kind of understanding. "Take care of my girl," Robert said, shaking Sebastian's hand. "With my life," Sebastian replied, and Grace knew he meant it. During the drive back, they drove in comfortable silence for a long time. Finally, Sebastian spoke. "Thank you." "For what?" "For letting me meet them, for showing me where you come from." Sebastian paused. "Grace, your parents, they really love each other, don't they? Completely for 35 years. I've never seen that before, love like that. Real, genuine, without pretense." Sebastian's voice was low, almost reverent. "My parents, they had what they called a strategic marriage. Respectful, but not that." Grace looked at him. "Does that bother you?" "It makes me realize what I missed, what I never had." Sebastian met her eyes briefly before returning his attention to the road. "And it makes me want something I never thought was possible." "Sebastian, Grace, I know I come from a different world. I know I have a lot to learn about real love, about real family. But I want to learn. With you." Grace felt her heart tighten. "And the event next week?" "The event next week will just be the beginning. Because after today, after seeing how you are with your family, how your parents love each other, I don't want to hide what I feel for you anymore." Sebastian reached out his hand, and Grace took it, intertwining their fingers. "I love you, Grace Carter," he said simply. "And I want the whole world to know." Grace felt tears sting her eyes. It wasn't just the words, it was the sincerity behind them, the transformation she could see in him after a day with her family. "I love you too," she whispered. And for the first time since they met, Grace truly believed that maybe, just maybe, two such different worlds could become one. 3 months had passed since the visit to Grace's family, and Sebastian had been true to his word. They appeared together at the charity event at the Metropolitan Museum, facing the whispers and curious looks of New York's elite. Grace had stood firm beside Sebastian as he introduced her as his girlfriend, observing some expressions of shock and others of poorly disguised disdain. But Sebastian hadn't wavered once. Since then, they had built a comfortable routine. Dinners at small restaurants Sebastian discovered through Grace, walks in Central Park, quiet evenings at his apartment watching movies he had never had time to see. Grace had her own drawer in Sebastian's dresser, and he had become a regular visitor to her modest Brooklyn apartment. It was a freezing Saturday in February when Sebastian suggested they visit Grace's parents again. "No special reason?" Grace asked, looking out the window at the snow beginning to fall. "Can't I want to see your family without having a specific motive?" Sebastian was in the kitchen making breakfast, a skill he had recently acquired and of which he was inordinately proud. "Of course you can. It's just that you seem nervous." Sebastian almost dropped the spatula. "Nervous?" "I'm not nervous." Grace approached him, studying his expression. "Sebastian Montgomery, you are definitely nervous. Your shoulders are tense. You're fussing with the food more than necessary, and you've avoided looking directly at me for the past 15 minutes. Sebastian sighed, turning off the stove. "Sometimes I forget how well you know me. So what's going on?" Sebastian turned to face her, running his hands through his hair. That familiar gesture she now recognized as indicative that he was about to say something important. "Grace, these past months have been the best of my life. Mine too. You've changed me. Not just how I see relationships or family, but how I see everything. Work, success, what really matters." Sebastian took a step toward her. "Before you, I existed. Now, I live." Grace felt her heart speed up. "Sebastian, let me finish, please." He took her hands. "I know we still have things to figure out. I know my family can be challenging. I know sometimes I still think like a CEO instead of thinking like a boyfriend. But I also know I don't want to imagine a future without you in it." "What are you saying?" Sebastian smiled, that genuine, slightly nervous smile she loved. "I'm saying I want to ask you to marry me, but I want to do it right. I want to ask your parents' blessing first." Grace felt like the world had stopped spinning. "You want to propose?" "I do. More than anything I've ever wanted in my life." Sebastian lifted one of her hands and kissed it gently. "But only if you think you might want to say yes." Grace looked at him, really looked. She saw the man who had evolved from a cold, controlling CEO to someone who made breakfast on Saturday mornings and remembered to call asking how her day went. She saw the man who had faced New York society's scrutiny for her, who had sat on her parents' living room floor playing cards and laughing at embarrassing stories from her childhood. "I might," she whispered. Sebastian's smile was like the sunrise. "So shall we visit your parents?" 2 hours later, they were on the familiar road to Millbrook. Grace watched the snow-covered landscape, trying to process what was happening. Sebastian had proposed. Well, almost proposed, and she had said she might accept. "You're quiet," Sebastian observed. "I'm processing." "Regrets?" Grace turned to look at him. "About us? Never. But Sebastian, are you sure about this? About me? About us?" "Grace, I've never been sure of anything the way I'm sure of this." "But what about your family and their expectations about who you should marry?" Sebastian was quiet for a moment. "My family will have to accept who I choose, and if they don't, that will be their decision, not ours." "What if they reject you because of me?" "Then they don't deserve me, and I definitely don't deserve them." Sebastian reached out and took her hand. "Grace, you taught me that real family isn't about blood or status. It's about love, support, acceptance. If my family can't do that, then you, Robert Helen, you are my real family." Grace felt tears sting her eyes. "How do you always manage to say exactly the right thing?" "Years of practice in corporate meetings," Sebastian joked, making Grace laugh. When they arrived at the Carter house, they were greeted with the warm enthusiasm Grace always associated with home. Helen was in the kitchen preparing an elaborate lunch. Apparently, Sebastian had called ahead to let them know they were coming. "You didn't need to go to so much trouble, Mom," Grace protested, seeing the table set with the good china. "Nonsense. Sebastian is practically family now." Grace and Sebastian exchanged a meaningful look. After lunch, while Grace helped her mother with the dishes, Sebastian approached Robert, who was reading the newspaper in the living room. "Mr. Carter, may I speak with you?" Robert lowered the newspaper, studying Sebastian's face. "Of course, son. sit down." Grace could hear them from the kitchen, but couldn't make out the words. Her mother obviously didn't have the same problem. "He's asking permission to marry you," Helen whispered, barely containing her emotion. "Mom, what? You think I don't recognize when a man is about to ask for someone's daughter's hand in marriage?" Helen hugged Grace tightly. "Oh, honey, I'm so happy." In the living room, Sebastian was sitting on the edge of the sofa, hands resting on his knees. "Mr. Carter, I love your daughter, more than I thought it was possible to love someone." Robert nodded slowly. "That's evident, son. I want to ask her to marry me. But first, I want your blessing." "And why do you think you need my blessing?" The question caught Sebastian off guard. Because it's the right thing. Because she's your daughter and—" "Sebastian," Robert interrupted gently, "Grace is a grown woman. She can make her own decisions. If you're asking for my blessing, it needs to be for a better reason than tradition." Sebastian considered this for a moment. "Because you and Helen raised an extraordinary woman, because you loved her in a way that made her strong, independent, kind, and brave, and because I want you to know I intend to honor what you built in her." Robert smiled slowly. "That's a better answer. So, do I have your blessing?" "Sebastian, you don't need my blessing. But you have my approval, my support, and my confidence that you'll make Grace happy." The two men stood and embraced, a genuine hug between men who had come to deeply respect each other. "Thank you," Sebastian said. "Take care of her, always." That evening, after dinner, Sebastian suggested a walk. The snow had stopped, leaving the world with a crystalline, magical appearance. Grace was bundled in a heavy coat, but still shivering slightly in the freezing air. "Sebastian, it's too cold to—" "Grace?" Sebastian stopped walking and turned to her. 3 years ago, I was a man who thought he knew everything about success, about power, about control. And then you were pushed onto that stage, looking terrified and completely out of place, and something in me awakened." Grace felt her heart begin to beat faster. "You taught me that real love isn't about possession or control. It's about partnership. It's about wanting the other person to shine, not trying to dim their light to enhance your own." Sebastian knelt right there on the snow-covered sidewalk in front of the house where Grace had grown up. "Grace Carter, will you marry me?" Grace looked down and saw Sebastian holding a small velvet box. When he opened it, it revealed not a huge diamond, as she might have expected, but a simple, elegant ring with an emerald at the center, the exact color of her eyes. "Sebastian," she whispered, "I know it's not the biggest ring in the world. I know you could have anything, but I wanted something that was about us, about who we are together, not about how much money I have." Grace knelt in the snow before him, taking his face in her hands. "Sebastian Montgomery, I would marry you if you proposed with a plastic ring from a gumball machine. Is that a yes?" "That's a yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, and then kissed her there in the snow in front of the simple house where she had learned about love for the first time. When they separated, Grace saw tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For teaching me how to love. For showing me that life can be more than just existing. For choosing to stay with me even when it was difficult." Grace smiled, looking at the ring on her hand, then at the man who had completely transformed himself for love. "Sebastian, do you realize what you just did? Proposed to you? You proposed to me in front of the house where I grew up, with my parents as witnesses, with a ring you chose thinking of me, not to impress anyone else." Grace kissed him softly. "You became exactly the man I knew you could be, and you became everything I never knew I needed." They walked back to the house hand in hand, ready to share the good news with Robert and Helen, ready to begin planning a future neither of them could have imagined a few months before. And for the first time in his life, Sebastian Montgomery felt truly rich. The 4 months following the engagement were an emotional roller coaster that tested every fiber of Grace and Sebastian's relationship. News of their engagement spread through New York society like wildfire through dry grass, generating sensationalist headlines and gossip that ranged from malicious to absurd. "Billionaire CEO marries employee, love story or gold digger" was one of the gentler headlines. Grace quickly learned to avoid social media and society columns, but it was impossible to escape completely. Women from Sebastian's circle, women she had met at that first gala, made cutting comments disguised as concern. Reporters tried to interview her when she left work. Photographers appeared in the most unexpected places. "This will pass," Sebastian insisted during one of the particularly difficult nights when Grace had come home to find a reporter waiting in her building's lobby. "When?" Grace asked, letting herself collapse onto the sofa in Sebastian's apartment. "Sebastian, they're investigating my life like I'm a criminal. I found out today that someone went to my high school looking for former teachers willing to talk about me." Sebastian sat beside her, pulling her into his arms. "I'm sorry. I didn't imagine it would be so invasive. I knew it would be difficult, but this—" Grace paused, trying to find the right words. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living in a zoo." It was in this tumultuous context that they began planning the wedding, and that's when the real battles began. St. Patrick's Cathedral is out of the question, Evelyn Montgomery announced during the first and only planning dinner Grace attempted to have with Sebastian's family. "It's too big, too public. It'll look like we're putting on a spectacle." Grace looked at Sebastian, expecting him to intervene, but he seemed to be weighing his words carefully. "Mother," he said finally, "Grace and I want to get married at the cathedral. Sebastian, be reasonable. With all this negative publicity, a discreet wedding would be more appropriate. Something intimate, family-oriented, perhaps at the club." "Negative publicity," Grace repeated, her voice colder than intended. Evelyn turned to her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Dear, you must understand that this situation is unusual. Sebastian had never shown serious interest in marriage before, and then, suddenly he met someone he truly loves," Grace finished. "Of course, dear, but you must admit the circumstances are peculiar. The auction, the difference in social position—" "Enough." Sebastian placed his hand over Grace's. "Mother, Grace and I are getting married at St. Patrick's Cathedral, as planned, and anyone who can't accept that with joy is free not to attend." The silence that followed was deafening. Sebastian, his father, Charles Montgomery, spoke for the first time that evening. "You're being hasty. Perhaps a longer engagement." "No." Sebastian stood up. "We're getting married in June as planned, at the cathedral as planned, and our guest list will include all the people who love us and love us back." Grace also stood. "Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery, I understand this isn't the situation you imagined for Sebastian, but he makes me happy, and I hope to make him happy too. If you can accept that, we'll be honored by your presence. If you can't, we'll respect your decision." They left the Montgomery house that night, not knowing if Sebastian's family would attend the wedding. "I'm sorry," Sebastian said in the car. "They'll come around eventually. They just need time." "And if they don't?" Sebastian stopped at a traffic light and turned to look at her. "Then we'll get married surrounded by the people who really matter." The answer came 2 weeks later, in the form of a cold phone call from Evelyn. "We'll be present," she said simply. "After all, he's our son." It wasn't the warm acceptance Grace had hoped for, but it was a beginning. The wedding day dawned with a perfect June blue sky. Grace woke up in her parents' apartment. They had insisted on coming to New York a week early to help with preparations, with butterflies in her stomach and a smile that seemed permanently attached to her face. "Ready, honey?" Helen asked, helping Grace into the dress they had chosen together. Simple, elegant, perfect. More than ready. St. Patrick's Cathedral was beautiful, decorated with white and gold flowers. As Grace walked down the aisle arm in arm with her father, she looked at the guests and saw two worlds literally divided by the church's aisles. On one side, Sebastian's friends and family, executives in expensive suits, socialites in designer dresses, people whose names regularly appeared in financial columns. On the other side, Grace's family and friends, teachers, mechanics, neighbors, ordinary people living extraordinarily loving lives. But at the altar, when her eyes met Sebastian's, nothing else mattered. He was radiant, his eyes shining with unshed tears as he watched her approach. When Robert placed Grace's hand in Sebastian's, she felt like all the pieces of her life were finally falling into place. "You look beautiful," Sebastian whispered. "You don't look too bad yourself," Grace replied, making him laugh. The ceremony was perfect, traditional but personalized with vows they had written for each other. When it came time for Sebastian to speak, Grace saw him take a deep breath before beginning. Grace, when we met, I thought I knew what success was. I measured my life in profits, properties, and power lunches. And then you entered my life and taught me that real success is waking up every day next to someone who makes you want to be a better version of yourself. Grace felt tears streaming down her face. You taught me that love isn't about owning someone. It's about choosing someone every day. It's about building something together that's greater than anything we could be alone. When it was Grace's turn, she looked at Sebastian and then at the congregation, at the two worlds witnessing their union. Sebastian, you taught me that true love doesn't diminish your differences. It celebrates them. You didn't try to transform me into someone who would fit into your world. Instead, you expanded your world to include me. She paused, looking directly at the section where Sebastian's family was seated. And today we're not just uniting our lives. We're uniting our families, our friends, our worlds. We're creating something new, a place where Wall Street executives can talk with mechanics about vintage cars, where retired teachers can exchange recipes with socialites, where what matters isn't how much money you have, but how much love you bring. A murmur of approval rippled through the congregation. Sebastian, I promise to love you not despite our differences, but because of them. I promise to build a life with you that honors where we came from and celebrates where we're going. When the priest declared them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was full of promise, joy, and a future they both could barely wait to begin. The reception was held at the Plaza Hotel, a concession to Sebastian's world, but with personal touches from Grace throughout. The band included both a classical string quartet and a jazz group Grace loved. The menu combined haute cuisine with home-style dishes that reminded Grace of home. The most memorable moment came during the speeches. Robert stood up, clearly nervous before the sophisticated audience. I'm not a man of many words, he began, but I want everyone to know that Sebastian isn't just gaining a wife today. He's gaining a family that loves him as if he were our own son. He looked directly at the Montgomerys as he spoke, and Grace isn't just gaining a husband, she's gaining all of you. Because that's what family does. It grows to include the people we love. The response was genuine applause from both sides of the room. But it was Evelyn Montgomery who surprised everyone. She stood up spontaneously, something that clearly wasn't planned. I must admit, she began, her voice hesitant, that I initially had reservations about this union. Grace felt Sebastian stiffen beside her. But today, seeing my son happier than I've ever seen him, seeing how Grace has made him smile, seeing how your families have come together with such grace and love. Evelyn paused, looking directly at Grace. I realize that sometimes the best surprises come in packages we didn't expect. She raised her glass. To Grace and Sebastian, may you build a life as beautiful as the love you share. The room exploded in applause, and Grace saw tears in Sebastian's eyes. Later that night, when the last guests had gone home and they were finally alone in their suite, Grace and Sebastian sat on the balcony overlooking Central Park. Do you think it worked? Grace asked, still in her wedding dress but barefoot. The wedding? I'd say it was a resounding success. No, silly. The blending of our worlds. Sebastian considered the question, thinking about the evening they had just lived through. Did you see Victoria Ashworth talking to Jessica about makeup techniques, and my mother asking your mother for her apple pie recipe? Grace laughed. Your mother will never make an apple pie. No, but she asked for the recipe, and that means something. Grace leaned back in her chair, watching the city lights. So what do we do now? Now? Sebastian leaned over and kissed her bare shoulder. Now we build a life together, a life that honors where we came from and celebrates where we're going. Mrs. Montgomery, he added, smiling. I'm still getting used to that, Grace admitted. We have a lifetime for you to get used to it. And for the first time since the auction that had brought them together, Grace knew with absolute certainty that no matter what challenges came, they would face them together. 6 months after the wedding, Grace Montgomery, still getting used to the surname, was sitting in her new office on the 30th floor of the Montgomery Renewables building, looking at a stack of proposals that seemed more like promises of change than simple work documents. The office wasn't ostentatious like Sebastian's, but it had large windows with a city view and was decorated with a mixture of professional elegance and personal touches that made her feel at home. Photos of her family, a plant her mother had insisted on giving as an office gift, and a frame with the first project proposal she had presented to Sebastian. "How are you feeling, Madam Director?" Sebastian asked from the doorway, leaning against the frame with that smile that still made Grace's heart race. "Like I'm about to throw up from nerves," Grace admitted, gesturing to the documents scattered across her desk. "Sebastian, are you sure about this? I've never managed anything bigger than a school project. Have you forgotten how you organized our wedding? How you coordinated two completely different worlds and made them work together?" Sebastian entered and sat in the chair across from her desk. "Grace, you have something that can't be taught in any MBA. You understand people. You see needs that others ignore." The Foundation for Art and Energy had been Grace's idea, born from a conversation during their honeymoon in Tuscany. They were visiting a small town where local artists had transformed an old windmill into a community center, powered by solar energy, teaching children about art and sustainability simultaneously. "Imagine if we could do this in New York," Grace had said, her eyes shining as she watched children painting outdoors while learning about renewable energy. "Imagine if we could bring art and environmental education to the communities that need it most." Sebastian had seen the passion in her eyes and knew immediately he would do anything to make that vision reality. Now, 6 months later, the foundation was about to be officially launched, with Grace as executive director and an initial budget of $5 million. "The board meeting is in an hour," Sebastian said, checking his watch. "Are you ready?" Grace took a deep breath, looking one last time at her notes. "Remember when our biggest concern was whether your parents would accept that you were marrying me? And now you're about to present a 5-year plan to transform environmental education in underserved communities through art." Sebastian stood and approached her. "Grace, do you realize what you've accomplished?" "We accomplished? No. This is you. Your vision, your passion, your ability to see possibilities where others see problems." The board meeting was a surprising success. Grace had spent weeks preparing, but discovered that when she was talking about something she believed in deeply, the words flowed naturally. The Foundation for Art and Energy isn't just about teaching children to paint or about installing solar panels, Grace explained to the group of investors and philanthropists gathered in the conference room. It's about showing these children that they can be creators of beauty and solutions at the same time. She clicked to the next slide of her presentation, showing photos of the community in Tuscany that had inspired everything. "Our first pilot project will be in the South Bronx, in partnership with 3 local schools. We'll build a completely sustainable community art center, where children from 6 to 16 can learn traditional artistic techniques alongside renewable energy principles." James Morrison, one of the most skeptical investors at the table, leaned forward. "Mrs. Montgomery, this sounds admirable, but how do we measure success? How do we know if we're really making a difference?" Grace smiled. She had expected that question. "Great question, Mr. Morrison. Our success indicators include not just participation and school grades, but also measurable creativity, environmental awareness, and, perhaps most importantly, how many of these children begin to see themselves as problem solvers instead of victims of circumstances." She showed the next slide, with data from similar programs around the world. Studies show that children who participate in integrated art and science programs are 40% more likely to pursue STEM careers, 60% more likely to engage in environmental activism, and this is my favorite, 80% more likely to say they can make a difference in the world. The murmur of approval around the table was unmistakable. After the meeting, Grace found herself surrounded by board members wanting to discuss details, offering connections, suggesting expansions. It was exciting and overwhelming at the same time. "You were incredible," Sebastian whispered in her ear when they finally got a moment alone. "I was terrified. It didn't show. You seemed natural, like you were born to do this." In the months that followed, Grace discovered that Sebastian was right. She had been born for this. The foundation quickly became the center of her life, not in an obsessive way, but in a deeply satisfying way she had never experienced in previous jobs. The Pilot Center in the South Bronx opened in January, a modest but bright building with solar panels on the roof and community gardens on the sides. Grace spent at least 2 days a week there, working directly with the children and teachers. "Look, Mrs. G." An 8-year-old girl named Sophia ran up to Grace one February afternoon holding a painting she had made. "I painted our garden with solar energy." The painting showed the center's garden, but with solar panels drawn as giant flowers and wind turbines as dancing trees. It was technically incorrect but creatively brilliant. "It's beautiful, Sophia. Tell me about it." "Well, I thought, what if clean energy was as pretty as flowers? And then I thought maybe someday I could invent solar panels that actually look like flowers." Grace felt her heart tighten. This was exactly the mindset she had hoped to cultivate. "You know what, Sophia? There are scientists working on that right now, and who knows? Maybe you'll be one of them when you grow up." Sophia's eyes lit up. "Really? I can be a scientist and an artist?" "You can be anything you want to be." That evening, Grace arrived home at the apartment she and Sebastian had bought on the Upper West Side, smaller than Sebastian's penthouse, but full of light and life, to find her husband in the kitchen preparing dinner. "How was your day?" he asked, kissing her as she entered. Grace told him about Sophia and her painting, about the new group of teenagers who had signed up for sustainable design classes, about the teacher who had said it was the most exciting program she had ever worked with. "And Marcus, you remember the 15-year-old who said art was girly stuff? Today he showed me a design for a rainwater collection system he wants to install at school. And it's functionally sound, Sebastian, like he'd studied engineering." Sebastian smiled, watching the passion in his wife's eyes. "You know you're changing lives, don't you? We are. The foundation wouldn't exist without you." "Grace, I just provided the money. You provided the soul." 6 months later, the foundation had expanded to 3 additional locations, with waiting lists at each one. Grace had hired a team of 12 people, a mix of educators, artists, and environmental engineers, and was working on partnerships with local museums and universities. "We have an interesting proposal," Grace said during dinner on a Thursday. "The Met wants to collaborate with us on an exhibition about art and sustainability, featuring work from our children alongside established artists." "That's incredible," Sebastian replied, "and a bit ironic, considering it was at the Met that everything began for us." Grace smiled, remembering that first gala where Sebastian had made his surprising offer. "Who would have thought that night would lead us here?" "You knew," Sebastian said, studying her face. "Maybe not consciously, but part of you knew something bigger was waiting." "How can you be sure?" "Because even that first night, when you were clearly terrified, you didn't run away. You faced the unknown because you knew it was worth it." Grace considered this. "And you? Did you know?" Sebastian paused, considering the question honestly. "I knew there was something different about you, something that made me want to be more than I was. But if you had asked me that night if I could imagine this," he gestured toward the foundation photos hanging on their walls, "I would have thought it impossible. And now? Now I can't imagine a version of myself that doesn't include you and everything we've built together." Grace got up from the table and approached the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, children were painting dreams of a more sustainable future. Teachers were discovering new ways to inspire. Families were learning about clean energy through art projects their children brought home. "Grace?" Sebastian approached from behind, wrapping her in his arms. "I was thinking," she said, leaning back against him, "about how strange life is. 2 years ago, I was answering phones and complaining that nothing ever happened to me. And now? Now I wake up every day knowing I'm going to do something that matters, and not just because of the work or the foundation." Grace turned in his arms. "But because I found someone who makes me want to be the best version of myself." Sebastian kissed her softly. "You know what my favorite part of all this is?" "What?" "That we're just getting started." Grace smiled, looking at the ring on her finger, still simple, still perfect, and then at the man who had transformed her life in ways she never could have imagined. "Yes," she agreed. "We're just getting started." The Upper West Side apartment had transformed over 5 years of marriage into something no decorator could have planned, but which perfectly reflected the life Grace and Sebastian had built together. The walls were a gallery of memories, photos from travels, art from the Foundation's children, certificates of recognition, and a framed photo from the day Grace had been named Philanthropist of the Year by the city of New York. It was a sunny October morning when Grace woke up with the familiar nausea that had tormented her for the past few weeks. Sebastian had already left for his morning run, a habit he had developed after Grace had commented a few years earlier that he spent too much time in offices and too little time outdoors. Grace headed to the kitchen, making ginger tea while mentally reviewing her day's agenda. The Foundation now operated in 15 locations across 3 states, had inspired similar programs in other cities, and Grace had just signed a contract to write a book about integrated education in art and sustainability. "You're up early," Sebastian said, coming through the door with his hair still damp with sweat, but smiling with that energy morning exercise always gave him. "I couldn't sleep anymore." Grace leaned in to kiss him, but pulled away quickly. "You need a shower." Sebastian laughed, heading to the bathroom, but paused at the door. "Grace, are you okay? You seem different today." Grace looked at him through the steam of her tea, studying the man who had become even more handsome over the years. Some expression lines around his eyes, hair with a few grey strands at the temples, but the same dark eyes that had captivated her that first night. "Sebastian, sit down for a minute." Something in her tone made him forget the shower completely. He approached, concern immediately visible on his face. "What happened? Is it about the Foundation, your parents?" "No, it's nothing like that." Grace took his hand, nervously playing with his wedding ring. "Sebastian, do you remember when we talked about having children? Of course, we said when the right time came, when the Foundation was stable, when—" Sebastian stopped abruptly, his eyes widening. "Grace, I took 3 tests yesterday, all positive." The silence that followed was charged with pure emotion. Grace watched expressions pass across Sebastian's face, shock, joy, fear, and then a happiness so intense she felt tears stinging her own eyes. "Are you sure?" "I have a doctor's appointment next week, but yes, I'm pretty sure." Sebastian pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of crystal. "My God, Grace, we're going to have a baby." "We're going to have a baby," she confirmed, melting into his embrace. They stayed like this for several minutes, just absorbing the magnitude of the news. Finally, Sebastian pulled back enough to look at her. "How are you feeling? Physically, I mean." "Nauseous, tired, but happy, Sebastian. Happier than I thought possible." "And about work? The Foundation?" Grace had thought about this since confirming the pregnancy. "I'm going to keep working, at least for now. The team is incredible, and you know I couldn't just stop." "I know. And I don't want you to stop. I just want to make sure you're taking care of yourself." "We're taking care of each other, like always." Later that day, after Sebastian had reluctantly gone to work, only because Grace insisted she was fine and they had to maintain some normalcy, Grace found herself at the Foundation's original center in the South Bronx, watching Sophia, now 13, teach a group of younger children about solar energy. "The coolest thing about solar panels," Sophia was explaining, with the confidence of someone who had found her passion, "is that they transform something that's always existed, sunlight, into something that can power our homes, our schools, our dreams." Grace smiled, unconsciously placing her hand over her still flat stomach. Sophia had become one of the Foundation's most visible success stories, earning a full scholarship to a prestigious prep school, but still returning regularly to help with the younger children. "Mrs. G," a 6-year-old girl ran up to Grace, "look what I drew." The drawing showed a family, mother, father, and a baby, all holding hands in front of a house covered with flowers that were clearly solar panels. "It's beautiful, Maya. Tell me about your family here." "Well, they're very happy because they have energy from the sun and because they love each other very much," Maya explained, with the seriousness only small children can have about important matters. "And the baby will grow up learning about how to take care of the world." Grace felt her eyes fill with tears. "It's a perfect family, Maya." That evening, Grace and Sebastian dined at home, something they had made a point of prioritizing over the years, no matter how busy they were. Sebastian had cooked his specialty, a risotto he had perfected after years of trial and error. "Did you tell anyone?" he asked. "Not yet. I want to wait until after the doctor's appointment. And you?" "Same thing. But Grace, I can barely contain my excitement." Grace smiled, watching her husband. "You're already imagining what it'll be like, aren't you?" "I'm imagining a little girl who has your eyes and your determination, but who also knows how to find practical solutions to impossible problems. And if it's a boy, then I'm imagining a boy who has your compassion and who grows up knowing he can change the world if he really wants to." Grace leaned across the table and took his hand. "Sebastian, have you ever thought about how our life has changed since that first night? Every day. Sometimes I wonder who we'd be if I hadn't been pushed onto that stage." Sebastian considered this. "I think I'd still be a successful man, but empty, working hard but without real purpose. And you?" "I think I'd still be waiting for my real life to begin." "And now?" Grace looked around the apartment they had made a home, thought about the foundation that had become much more than she had ever dreamed, thought about the baby growing inside her. "Now I know that sometimes the best things in life come when you least expect them, and that real love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone who makes you want to grow." Sebastian raised his water glass. Grace had stopped drinking wine as soon as she suspected the pregnancy. To growing together. To growing together. 2 months later, they were in her parents' living room in Millbrook, surrounded by Helen and Robert, sharing the good news. Helen cried. Robert hugged Sebastian as if he were truly his son, and Grace felt enveloped by the same unconditional love she had known all her life. "So it'll be Grandma Helen and Grandpa Bob?" Helen asked, her eyes still shining with tears of joy. "You'll be the most beloved grandparents in the world," Grace confirmed. Later that night, when they were walking through the neighborhood where Grace had grown up, Sebastian took her hand. "You know what I was thinking?" "What?" "About how lucky we are. Not just that we found each other, but because our child will grow up knowing this kind of love." Sebastian gestured toward the small but light-filled house where they had just spent the afternoon. "We'll grow up knowing that family isn't about money or status. It's about showing up for each other every day. And we'll grow up knowing they can make a difference in the world," Grace added, "whether through art, science, business, or simply being a good person. Especially being a good person." Grace stopped walking and turned to look at Sebastian. "Are you nervous about being a father?" Sebastian considered the question honestly. "Terrified, and you?" "Me too, but Sebastian, I can't imagine doing this with anyone else." "Neither can I." 6 months later, on a sunny May morning, Emma Grace Montgomery was born with her mother's green eyes, her father's smile, and a determination that was already evident in how firmly she grasped anything that came near her tiny hands. "She's perfect," Sebastian whispered, holding his daughter for the first time, tears flowing freely down his face. "She's ours," Grace replied, extending her finger so the baby could grasp it. And there in that simple hospital room, with their newborn daughter sleeping peacefully between them, Grace knew her life had found its true purpose. Not just in the work she loved, or in the man she had chosen to share her life with, but in the promise that Emma would grow up knowing that true love is built every day, with small acts of kindness, brave choices, and the conviction that every person can make a difference in the world. "Welcome to the world, Emma," Grace whispered. "You're going to love it here." Sebastian kissed Grace's forehead, then Emma's, and knew he finally understood what it meant to be truly rich. It had nothing to do with money. It had everything to do with love that multiplies instead of diminishes, with purpose that deepens over time, and with the certainty that life's best adventures were only just beginning. Grace and Sebastian proved that true love knows no social boundaries or class differences. It transcends opposing worlds when two people choose to grow together, every day. Little Emma now sleeps in their arms, heir not only to a fortune, but to something far more valuable. The certainty that she can be anything she dreams. Because sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with a brave heart that accepts the unknown. And perhaps, deep down, this story also speaks to all of us, to our infinite capacity to love and transform. If this story touched you, please leave your like to strengthen this energy of true love. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that warm the heart, and tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this message from? Your support is what allows us to continue bringing stories like this to you.